Okay, so yesterday we saw that if Israel chose to obey God, they would see his blessings, and disobey him, then his curse. So that's where we're picking up, chapter 8. Now it came about at the end of the 20 years in which Solomon had built the house of the Lord and his own house, that he built the cities which Hiram had given to him, and settled the sons of Israel there. Then Solomon went to Hamath Zobah and captured it. He built Tadmor in the wilderness and all the storage cities which he had built in Hamath. He also built Upper Beth Horon and Lower Beth Horon, fortified cities with walls, gates, and bars. And Baalath and all the storage cities that Solomon had, and all the cities for his chariots and cities for his horsemen, and all that it pleased Solomon to build in Jerusalem, in Lebanon, and in all the land under his rule. All the people who were left of the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, who were not of Israel, namely, from their descendants who were left after them in the land whom the sons of Israel had not destroyed, them Solomon raised as forced laborers to this day. But Solomon did not make slaves for his work from the sons of Israel. They were men of war, his chief captains and commanders of his chariots and his horsemen. These were the chief officers of King Solomon, 250 who ruled over the people. Then Solomon brought Pharaoh's daughter up from the city of David to the house which he had built for her. For he said, "My wife shall not dwell in the house of David, king of Israel, because the places are holy where the ark of the Lord has entered." Then Solomon offered burnt offerings to the Lord on the altar of the Lord, which he had built before the porch, and did so according to the daily rule, offering them up according to the commandment of Moses, for the Sabbaths, the new moons, and the 3 annual feasts, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of Booths. Now, according to the ordinance of his father David, he appointed the divisions of the priests for their service, and the Levites for their duties of praise and ministering before the priests according to the daily rule, and the gatekeepers by their divisions at every gate. For David, the man of God, had so commanded. And they did not depart from the commandment of the king to the priests and the Levites in any manner or concerning the storehouses. Thus, all the work of Solomon was carried out from the day of the foundation of the house of the Lord and until it was finished. So the house of the Lord was completed. Then Solomon went to Ezion-Geber and to Eloth on the seashore in the land of Edom. And Hiram, by his servants, sent him ships and servants who knew the sea. And they went with Solomon's servants to Ophir, and took from there 450 talents of gold, and brought them to King Solomon. Okay, so I told y'all that if we came across any feasts mentioned in our readings, that we were going to pause and take a closer look. In verse 13 today, 3 of them were mentioned. We already discussed the Feast of Booths, also known as the Feast of Tabernacles, back in chapter 5. So let's look at the Feast of Unleavened Bread and the Feast of Weeks today, instead of prayer time. All right. So the Feast of Unleavened Bread goes back to the original Passover from Exodus chapter 12, when the Israelites were instructed to put blood from the Passover lamb on the lintel and doorposts of their houses, so that the angel of the Lord would pass over their house. Verse 17 of Exodus chapter 12 says, "You shall also observe the Feast of Unleavened Bread. For on this very day I brought your hosts out of the land of Egypt. Therefore, you shall observe this day throughout your generations as a permanent ordinance." So since the children of Israel left Egypt in a haste, they did not have time for the bread to rise. So it was made on that very first Passover without leaven, also known as yeast. In the Bible, leaven is almost always symbolic of sin. Like leaven that permeates the whole lump of dough, sin will spread in a person, a church, or a nation, eventually overwhelming and bringing its participants into bondage and eventually to death. Thank God that today our Passover lamb is Christ, who delivers us from our bondage and our sin. Okay, so then moving from Exodus to Leviticus chapter 23, the Feast of Weeks is mentioned as the second of 3 solemn feasts that all Jewish males were required to travel to Jerusalem to attend. This important feast gets its name from the fact that it starts 7 full weeks, or exactly 50 days, after the Feast of First Fruits. Since it takes place exactly 50 days after the previous feast, this feast is also known as Pentecost, which means 50. Each of 3 solemn feasts, Passover, the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of Tabernacles, required that all able-bodied Jewish males travel to Jerusalem to attend the feasts and offer sacrifices. The Feast of Weeks was in celebration of the first fruits of the wheat harvest, and the Feast of Tabernacles that we talked about in chapter 5 involved offerings of the first fruits of the olive and grape harvests. Another important requirement of the Feast of Weeks is that when the Jews harvested their fields, they were required to leave the corners of the field untouched and not gather any gleanings as a way of providing for the poor and strangers. To the Jews, this time of celebration is known as Shavuot, which is the Jewish word meaning weeks. Besides being called the Feast of Weeks in Leviticus chapter 23, this special feast celebration is called the Day of the First Fruits in Numbers chapter 28 and the Feast of Harvest as well. Like other Jewish feasts, the Feast of Weeks is important in that it foreshadows the coming Messiah and his ministry. Each and every one of the 7 Jewish feasts signifies an important aspect of God's plan of redemption through Jesus Christ. On the day of Pentecost, or the Feast of Weeks, the first fruits of the church were gathered by Christ as some 3,000 people heard Peter present the gospel after the Holy Spirit had empowered and indwelt the disciples as promised. With the promised indwelling of the Holy Spirit, the first fruits of God's spiritual harvest under the new covenant began. Today, that harvest continues as people continue to be saved. But there is also another coming harvest whereby God will again turn his attention back to Israel so that all Israel will be saved. And we see that in Romans chapter 11, verse 26. So there is definitely significance to these feasts and something we should continue paying attention to. All right, guys, thank you so much for being here. Hope you have a wonderful day and God bless you. Take care.